Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Saving Our Suburbs, Part 3, Smart Suburbs. I'm Jen Hawes, Partnership Manager for Island Press. This is our final installment in the three-part webinar series in association with the book Suburban Remix. All attendees are encouraged to get a copy of the book today for a discount from Island Press using the code webinar, as you can see here. Part 1 and 2 of the series took place in November 2018 and January 2019, with recordings available on the Island Press website. You can expect to receive a recording of the webinar today in the next day or two. Feel free to share this as it's an educational resource. Your questions are encouraged during this conversation, and you can put them into the questions box on the side panel of your GoToWebinar panel. Today's webinar is being hosted by Island Press. Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those who seek to understand and protect the environment, create solutions to its complex problems, then create solutions to its complex problems. Island Press elevates voices of change, shines a spotlight on crucial issues, and focuses attention on sustainable solutions, like we're doing today with this free webinar presentation. Today, we are pleased to share that we are offering a 1.5 AICP-CM credits from the National Capital Area Chapter of the American Planning Association. We'd like to give a big thank you to them for providing this to us as a sponsor. Thank you for sponsoring this webinar. So today's webinar, we have three esteemed panelists we are going to share with you. They are David Dixon, Lisa Nisenson, and Dan Baxter. So our first panelist is David Dixon. David leads planning for Stantec's Urban Places, 4 events which share a common theme of creating more livable, equitable, and resilient places sum up his career. David organized AIA's first national conference on density, myth, and reality, directed creation of New Orleans post-Katrina master plan, received the AIA's Thomas Jefferson Award for a lifetime of significant achievements in creating livable communities, vibrant civic places, and vital downtowns. And Residential Architecture magazine named him to its Hall of Fame as the person we call when we have questions about cities. David is the co-editor of Suburban Remix with Jason Beskey. Lisa Nisenson is on the forefront of helping cities adopt innovation. She is Vice President of New Mobility and Connected Communities for the Wantman Group, developing new scenario and anticipatory planning services, as well as planning and project design that adapts to trends. She is founder of the civic startup Greater Places. She holds the leadership positions in the American Planning Association Sustainable Communities Division and Smart City Task Force. Previously, she had worked for Alta Planning and Design, Sarasota County, Florida, and US EPA Smart Growth Office. She's a graduate of Meredith College and Harvard University. Dan Baxter is the leader as leading a global ITS roads and vehicle practice at Stantec. A member of the National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board Standing Committee on Intelligent Transportation Systems, his specialty is leveraging existing IT infrastructure as a foundation for smart mobility. Dan has designed over $1 billion of implemented smart mobility assets in North America. Dan led the development of the self-driving vehicle code of practice in the United Arab Emirates. He managed the design of the smart mobility system on the US $16 million Central Artillery Tunnel project in Boston. Dan has managed testing, research, and design on 2 CAV test facilities. And today, our conversation will be moderated by Lisa Schamess. She is the Communications Manager for the Congress for New Urbanism. Lisa Schamess joined CNU in 2017 as the editor of their blog on suburban design, Building a Better Burb. She grew up in the suburbs of Dallas and walked away for decades before relocating to the suburban community of Wheaton, Maryland 4 years ago. As a longtime writer and editor in the field of community planning and placemaking, she's now working to reconcile her dedication to urbanism with the needs and realities of suburban America. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here moderating this discussion today. As Jen mentioned, I have a couple of dogs in this race to make the suburbs better places. And I'm with some of my favorite people, so that's a bonus. So thank you, Island Press and Jen Haas, and Jason Besky and David Dixon for organizing this whole webinar series that we've been working on. CNU is an international nonprofit. We work to build vibrant communities where people have more choices for where they live, work, and get around. We have about 2,600 members, mostly designers, planners, developers, engineers, people who do the work, but also concerned citizens who care about how design and development can help communities thrive and prosper. So our members have been watching and influencing the development of AV and smart technology for cities for some years. And we've been watching with a mix of excitement and skepticism. It seems like at this moment when there's like so much more demand than ever before for walkable human scale places, AVs are like, if we were in an 80s movie, AVs would be like the kid from California who comes to small town high school. Suddenly everything's fine and suddenly there's all this excitement. So, you know, we feel like AVs have this enormous potential to either support or disrupt the progress that we've been making. And I think that's especially true in the suburbs, where we know that we're going to need a really, really big lift, literally, to give people alternatives to driving alone and to make their daily lives more connected and more livable. So I'm here today with the question, you know, what might AVs do to or for that proposition? I do want to put in a quick plug. This winter, CNU is embarking on several actually place-based considerations of AV technology, and we're really grateful to Stantec as our partner for coming to us for that opportunity. So stay tuned because we're going to start testing out some of our ideas about how urbanism and AVs can mix and perhaps work together really well. As an important side note, I also want to invite folks to find out more about an upcoming transportation and land use summit that we are sponsoring in Washington, D.C., October 24th, 25th. And certainly the interactions of AVs in the suburbs won't be a central focal point, but they really do deserve some deep discussion at that summit. And so if you've signed up for this webinar and you're interested in this topic, we'd encourage you to continue the discussion with us in October. If you want information about that, you can get in touch with our transportation program fellow, Benjamin Crowther, and his email is bcrowther, Crowther @cnu.org. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Jen, and we'll get started with the presentations.
Great, and I am sharing the screen with David now. So David, you know when you get that. Perfect.
Thank you. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So hello, everybody, and thank you so much for dialing in or going online to share this with us today. I have to mention immediately to Lisa Schamess that I grew up in Los Angeles, so I get to be the kid from California who showed up at high school, and I'm going to try and play that role to the hilt. Let me start by saying that this is, well, repeating as Lisa and Jen have both said, this is the third of 3 seminars. The first was successful, the second was opportunistic, and the third is smart. You might note that spells S-O-S, Suburbs. Can you all see my screen okay, or is there something on it that shouldn't be there? So, okay. So what I'm going to do is set the stage for our conversation by talking about how the advent of technology, autonomous mobility, and all the other rapidly forming technological changes that are reshaping or helping to reshape our regions are happening at a time of dramatically different demographics and a dramatically different economy than, for example, were the case when universal automobile ownership, for example, took hold following World War II and so dramatically reshaped our regions and frankly gave birth to the suburban boom where more than half of us now live. But I'm going to start with demographics. So these 3 kids, 2 dogs, and 1 old house, this is a blog from from Cape Town, are actually a wee bit, they may look young and current, like kids from Los Angeles, but they are actually a little bit of the past. Because well, when I grew up, being very, very old, I turned the television on. This is what the world looked like to me. Anybody who wants to tell us who they think some of these characters are, please do. It would make me feel better. But the main message here is that nobody turns on television unless these things are being recycled and sees images like this. We see a very different set of images today that reflect how fundamentally we have changed as a society in terms of our demographics, with huge implications for how our regions are going to be shaped and the ways in which forces like autonomous mobility are going to shape them. So for most of the years following World War II, if you look at this, the graph here, look at the bar, the vertical bar called 1970, blue dot, the blue portion of the bar indicates households with just singles or couples. The pale green, single parents with children. The dark orange, two parents with children. It is only two parents with kids, households with two adults and kids, that on balance prefer freestanding suburban houses, which make up the large majority of our suburban housing stock. Housing is 2/3 of our real estate economy. Where housing goes, our regions go. Let's fast forward, skip right past 2015, and you can see how different the world looks. More than 50%, considerably more than 50% of our households are singles and couples. In fact, the share of households with two parents and kids is on its way to 15%. That orange is a little understating there. That's my mistake. So now let's look to the house to the right. All that orange on that house indicates the fact that 62% of the current U.S. household housing stock is single family, most of that detached. That is a housing stock geared towards, by 2025, that 62% is geared towards 15% of our housing market. Now, obviously, other folks buy single family detached houses, but if you look at where people would prefer to live unconstrained by price or availability, let's look at the other side of that. 38% of our housing stock tends to be more urban. Going forward, the very large share of demand is going to be for that increasingly scarce housing stock. So for the next 2 decades, 80+%. Everybody, you're going to remember one set of numbers from what I say. Please remember that 80+% of all net new households for the next 2 decades are going to be singles and couples. Imagine where they want to live, and you will see that despite all the press and excitement and everything else that urban places, cities have gained in recent years, we are at the cusp, not peak urban. Even at cusp urban, meaning the on balance net preference for urban housing. If you look at a region like my dear region of Boston, you will notice that dark blue indicates how much housing prices have not yet recovered to their pre-recession, pre-2008 levels. Dark red in the center indicates how much of a premium housing now claims compared to 2007, 2008. Clearly, across America, it is our cores where prices are rising, housing costs and values are rising. In fact, urban housing has risen more than close to 3 times as fast as suburban housing. The real message here is that the same forces at work in our urban cores that we look around and see that are producing constant cranes in the sky and construction of new luxury, whatever we want to call it, 1 and 2 bedroom rental housing everywhere in lofts, are also at work at suburbs. They represent just as much of an opportunity for suburbs as they do for cities to create, and hence the title of Suburban Remix, or the subtitle, The Next Generation of Urban Places, because it is in suburbs that this trend will now take hold. This is meant to be an optimistic look at suburbs, understanding that their future will be far more urban than it has been in the past. But it is not just around their opportunity is much more urban. It is not just around opportunity there's also an imperative. And it starts with this chart in the upper left, which basically tells us, it says the US is adding fewer new workers, that in 2040, we will add fewer new workers to our workforce than we did in 2010, with a dramatic trough in between. At the same time, 80+% of all net new jobs, or excuse me, 90+% of all net new jobs require some form, at least 2 years of college education. We are developing a fundamental shortage of skilled and educated workers. If you go to the chart below, creating a knowledge worker shortage, you can see that actually this is across the developed world, not just the US. It's now at about 10%. And growing. This already costs the US economy roughly, let me go back for a second, roughly 2 to 3% of our GDP. Go to the right here, you see two folks in, young man and young lady in orange, with it looking at the suburbs or the urban core. It turns out that folks with 4 more years of college under the age of 49, not just millennials, now are moving to cities on balance. Anybody with less than 4 years is moving out, because there is so much interest among college educated folks to be in urban cores that they are primarily what is pushing up prices, because they tend to earn more, forcing other folks out. The fact that they want to be in urban cores is pulling employers. Our economy's growth is all around our knowledge industries. Their raw material is basically college educated. I know this sounds terribly elitist, but it's very important. A workforce. As that workforce heads into cities to live and work, our knowledge economy, where the part of our economy that provides real growth, is following them at a faster rate than folks have been moving into cities compared to suburbs. So suburban office rents have risen 8 times, urban office rents 8 times faster than suburban since 2000, and that difference is accelerating. So what this means, basically, if you're a suburb and you want to increase your tax base, and you're not going to do it by simply raising residential taxes, particularly on values that are tending to be stagnant, you're under terrific pressure to attract a knowledge industry, to attract the part of our economy that's growing, providing increasing fiscal returns. That's our knowledge economy. To do that, you've got to attract knowledge workers. They are looking for urban, walkable, mixed use, lively, cool, fun places to live. I think this is a story well understood. So suburbs have, just like cities, a tremendous urban opportunity and imperative. So now let's go look at some other changes. I'm going to come to technology in a second, but a lot of attention is being paid to, oh my gosh, what's happening to retail? Well, there are 2 retail stories out there. One is big box, mass market, Kresge's, Target, Kmart, etc. These retailers are competing for a steadily shrinking pie, in part because Amazon is out competing them and will basically claim a majority of most of the markets that big retailers have claimed traditionally. The one area that they are not penetrating is food, experiential, entertainment, retail that is about the experience. More than half of all retail leases last year were actually for restaurants or someplace else that serve food, not by dollar volume or square footage, but by total number of leases. This, if you want to bring a street to life, want it to be walkable, it is this market you need to pursue. This is the retail niche that will continue to grow. It is heavily dependent on walk-to markets, not drive-to, but walk-to markets. Think higher density housing in a mixed-use environment surrounding a new main street. So now this sets the stage and brings us to technology. When Jason and I first started to work on Suburban Remix a number of years ago, and as a slight aside to everybody, there are 2 things that do not go well together in life. One is, and those would be writing and having a job. So it took longer than we anticipated, but that was very lucky, because when we first started the book, we paused for a minute and said, is there a book? Autonomous mobility is coming. Everyone's going to jump in their car, play computer games while they ride 30 miles out of town to wherever. Discovered that Stantec has probably the most robust, best developed autonomous mobility planning group, at least that we could find. Started talking to our colleagues and discovered that, in fact, the future of autonomous mobility is not Tesla's, it is shared autonomous mobility, that in fact, which thrives in dense, walkable, mixed-use areas with a critical mass of people and trips to create on-demand transportation at considerably less cost than a Lyft or Uber ride today and far less than private ownership. So our colleagues are telling us that in places that can, we are going to move from a model of owned mobility to shared mobility. That's in urban places that offer this critical mass of people and destinations and therefore on-demand trips. And in fact, if you look at, I'm sorry to go back here, if you look at this chart, shared AVs, CAVs will be mainstream. Basically, this is telling us that even as we move into the end of the 2020s, and certainly by the time we're in the 2030s, this is what the automobile industry is counting on what they will be producing. Ford, you've probably heard that Ford and Volkswagen have recently signed a cooperative deal. Like many others in the automobile industry, that's all about the fact that they are going to have to retool to shift from personal to shared mobility for a majority of what they produce. This might be the real advent of autonomous mobility might be 20 years off. It'll have all kinds of profound implications. But something else is happening closely related. The first part of autonomous mobility, which is connected mobility, and that is happening much faster. So what our good colleagues have basically told us is that by the mid to late 2020s, 8 years from now, maybe 10 at most, a majority of vehicles on the road in North America will have enough connected technology on board to park themselves. This has huge implications because they won't be able to drive us around because we won't have the regulations in place. But when a car parks itself, it will park itself much more compactly than we can park it, meaning that within the immediate lifetime of any parking structure that anybody in this audience is thinking about building as a planner, as an architect, as a developer, or you're reading about in a daily newspaper as part of a new project, that garage will have more capacity in 8 years, maybe 25 or 30% more capacity than it does today. So while we may only be at the cusp of urban, with peak urban to come, we are probably as a society at peak parking today. We probably will be able to build much of the dense urban walkable urban centers that we're talking about, thanks to this aspect of technology, within 8 to 10 years with significantly less parking, which is a huge cost and impediment today. That will be gone. Then 10 years later, mid to late 2030s, we will be in the era of shared autonomous mobility. These cars don't park. So there are all kinds of implications. One is the fact that the greatest cost, one of the most significant cost obstacles to higher density development suburbs, the fact that they need structured parking, this competes with surface parking nearby, will begin to disappear shortly, within certainly the immediate lifetime of any project on the planning drawing board today, and basically be gone 10 years later. Very simply, what this means is that if you go out and build 1 million square feet in the suburbs today, look at the 2010 blue bar here, you would need actually more than that, about 1,150,000 square feet of parking to accommodate the demand. This is a mixed use development of 1 million square feet. Let's fast forward, just in the interest of time, to the late 2020s. We're now able to build probably 2 million square feet supported by that same parking structure. So we can add another 1 million square feet without investing a penny in parking By the time we're in the era of shared autonomous mobility, we're probably going to be able to triple that density without additional investment, meaning that anything we plan or draw today, we need to think in terms of how can this grow and densify. We have left the era of sort of fixed plans that we draw in 2019 and build in 2025 or 27. By the time we build it, we'll be able to build much more, and we need to accommodate that flexibility. So I want to finish by suggesting a couple of thresholds for success and principles for creating the kinds of places that we really want to create. And I'll start with thresholds because these same forces are present across America. We're working in places outside of Dayton, outside of Minneapolis, outside of DC, outside of Boston, with very different economies, very different median household incomes, et cetera. In every case, we're working in communities that are beginning to adapt to this change, take advantage of these opportunities, while many of their neighbors don't. And the differences basically start with leadership. This is Mayor Eva Galambos, the mayor of Sandy Springs, Georgia, the most conservative community in which I have ever worked. They had privatized city governments, which I will suggest is not a good idea if you're thinking about it, and ended up using eminent domain and investing significant funds to create something called Sandy Springs created something called City Springs, a walkable, higher density, mixed use heart for Sandy Springs. It's about engagement. Some of you may recognize this guy from Mad Magazine. What me worry? A lot of suburban communities, really to engage them, you've got to engage them in the story of the kinds of changes I've talked about. This is Dublin, Ohio, where a city manager stepped forward and said, we may be one of the most successful suburbs in North America in terms of household incomes, in terms of the jobs that we're pulling out of Columbus, Ohio. That's all about to change based on demographics and where a knowledge economy is going. We need to have a downtown. And these folks in an iconic suburb basically said, we need to replace office parks like this with a walkable, mixed-use, lively downtown, which they are now building. This is actually a view of Bridge Park in Dublin, Ohio. Dublin has probably invested about $300 million of Dublin money, calls itself a city, it's really a suburb, to support about $1.5 billion or $2 billion worth of total investment in a walkable, livable new heart, new downtown for Dublin. It takes transformative planning, and that means, frankly, putting markets to work. Think for about a half a second the implications for markets of where demographics are headed, where is all the demand headed, housing drives change. This is a site affectionately known as Marshall's Plaza today outside of Boston, on its way to becoming this because we are able to work with the market, help the surrounding community understand, but the changes and how they can have basically a new village center for this part of Newton. But basically, it's really more than anything else, helping a developer understand just how much the market can do today. All of this, we have to understand, is aggravating a severe equity crisis that we already have, because the kinds of places we're talking about have all kinds of wonderful benefits. They also happen to attract people with more money. The top 5% of us by income control 43% of all consumption. Where we decide to live, play, or work becomes more expensive because we bid up the price. That means there are an awful lot of folks who are being left out, worse yet, pushed out. The number of folks living under the poverty line in suburbs is up by more than 60% just since 2000. This is all suburbs across the US. This is not because people with lower incomes want bigger backyards these days, and I'm sorry, that sounds awful. It is because they are being pushed out of rapidly evolving urban cores. When we create a new generation of suburban centers and cores, we need to remember to build in equity. So finally, as urban designers, what kind of places do we want to create? First of all, they're walkable. That's more than just saying, gee, let's have nice trees and paving. That's about starting with the density of walkability. Walkable density, we like to call it, 1 to 2,000 housing units within a 5-minute walk will bring a block of Main Street to life. It's that block of Main Street that people want to walk along. Then we get a chance to, with the density in mind, we can, if we have an older suburban center, we can actually pace the retail that brings it to life in front of the existing buildings. This is Crystal City, where Amazon is going, but they were started down this path first because they had the housing that would support this retail. Then we get to think about great design. So we start with walkability, then there's connectivity. And while connectivity makes us think immediately of walking and biking and taking cool transit into our suburban core, what it's really about is creating places in our new centers that speak to the full spectrum of the lives of the people in our community. In the case of Sandy Springs, a performing arts center that meant you just didn't live or work in the center, it was the heart of your life as a community. Public realm that speaks to the full realm of our lives, full spectrum of our lives, from a few kids getting together, people hanging out and along a cool Main Street and seeing friends walk by, to this is Dublin, Ohio again, where where the whole community can now come to celebrate along a new Main Street. Diversity, it's just great to say we want to have lots of people there, but it's more if you're going to have Starbucks, and that's supposed to be a cute grab from Game of Thrones, then you have places that appeal to very different people too. You need a realm of retail, a range of retail, of public spaces, of culture, of arts that appeal to the full spectrum of a community. And finally, authenticity. This is, we're outside places, so at the edge of Memphis, suburban edge of Memphis. We're working with a downtown partnership there that's involved here too. And this is just pop-up container, shipping container retail. But what's really important is they reach into the community. So the people who are the living culture of this community, who are the creative, the chefs, the designers, the folks making art, are the folks who are bringing these spaces to life and making this authentic to their community. I'm going to finish by saying, well, what did our speakers in the first two webinars, how did they respond to these changing circumstances? And we'll start with successful suburbs. Chris Lineberger basically point out that urbanizing the suburbs is the major trend of the next generation. Talked about the rapid growth of walk-ups across the US, basically made the point that those suburbs that are not adjusting are rapidly losing value. These two buildings are basically worth, probably in the DC suburbs, less than a third of what it costs to develop them. I'm sorry, 10 to 20% less than it costs to, 10 to 20% of what they're worth, I'm sorry, even worse, in 2005, as opposed to walk-ups, walkable urban places across the same region where values were up by 50 to 100%. And then he reminded us of the rapid rise in suburban poverty and the fact that we need, suburbs need the additional fiscal benefit of creating places that add value, because a rapid rise in suburban poverty brings significant new costs to suburbs. And here, talked about the rapid increases in value in the places in the same region that created those two buildings that are now worth a fifth of what they cost, the kinds of places that are rapidly gaining in value. And talked about examples from across the country, including Belmar outside of Denver, which is a very cool place. Talked about Dallas, the walk-up wake-up call, Dallas does urban. Then we followed that by opportunistic suburbs, and this was, okay, we know what makes a successful suburb, how do they pay for it? And Sarah Woodworth and Chris Zimmerman talked about the range of tools, starting with what happens if you have no tax abatement versus a tax abatement. Look at that, the yellow and green lines at the bottom of these boxes. Yield means how much is this deal worth? Basically, it's a profit of 5.6% without a tax abatement, 6.6% with, but that was enough to tip it over the balance. Look at the green below, because it needs more than a 6% return to attract investment. Tax credits are another way of boosting the value of projects. I'm sure most people on this call are familiar with tax increment finance. This is probably the prevalent tool at work in the US today. This is White Flint Mall, for example, where Sarah Woodworth did a lot of work, basically to get the host community to invest some more than $40 million in a $300+ million project. That $40 million was the tipping point that made this project work. When I mentioned the $300 million of Dublin investment, that was primarily TIF funds in that $1.5 billion development. So finally, thank you. This is an image I just love. This is something that Jason gave me. He was taking a walk with Robert E. Simon, the sort of the father, so to speak, of walkable suburbs, created Reston and ultimately, which then led to Reston Town Center. This is his statue. Jason called him up and said, "Would you give me a tour?" He and Jason went on a tour. They happened to walk by this family. That little girl in pink, as they walked by, turned to mommy and said, look, mommy, that man just got out of his statue." This is another approach to authenticity. Thank you so much. Look forward to your questions.
Right. With that, I will hand it over to Lisa.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And let me just get into the slideshow here. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. My name is Lisa Nisenson. I'm with WGI and have been working a lot on how we get to more value from our, is it working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. And really, how do we unlock value in our suburbs? And a lot of suburban development now is greenfield, where it's development driven. One of the things that we want to ponder, though, is with all of these new technologies, can we actually spur suburban retrofit, which is often almost always actually more difficult to catalyze. So how can we look at technology for that? The redevelopment situation is that our corridors are expected to support both throughput and economic activity at the same time. And what we're finding is that at 40 or 45 miles per hour, it really doesn't do either of those well, and it certainly doesn't do that safely. For housing, getting a use mix along these corridors can be difficult because they've just always been known for retail or commercial activity. And then finally, any catalyst these days, because of the lower values, we get a lot of facade treatments, which is an improvement. But then again, it kind of tips the scale for greenfield. So what I'm going to do is run through a lot of the new technologies that are not autonomous, but nonetheless can add a lot of value to how people can get around in suburbs. At the left here of your screen is a company that is based out of Los Angeles. They're growing rapidly, called Envoy, and they basically supply electric fleets to individual buildings or properties. And this is significant for suburbs because perhaps there may not be enough of a concentration of subscribers in a suburb, but you might be able to get enough in a building to actually replace the second car, or in a hotel to help people get around. And again, that brings some more economic value because you don't have to spend as much on parking. You've got mopeds and new enhanced electric bikes that really have a range of 2 to 5 miles. And again, in suburbs, this is very, very important, especially if you're trying to feed people to your new corridors. The one thing that we really need to pay attention to, though, is the electrification of these buildings and fleets. It's not as easy as just installing a bunch of chargers or plugs around. Once you have to heavy up, it does require a significant amount of planning and investment and partnerships. On-demand micro-transit, there are a lot of eyes on this. Some of the first models did not get off the ground successfully, but now what we're seeing in phase 2 are a lot of companies that are able to make it work, especially for park and rides. For design, some of the most successful pilots are located in space-constrained places, and the outcome is maybe we have enough area to actually have transit-oriented development. Another of these technologies that's really fun is disrupting the disruptors. There are now companies out there that basically allow you to build your own Uber or Lyft, so to speak. So if you're a master plan community or if you're a campus, you can basically develop your own fleets of cars. Again, this can provide mobility as an amenity for maybe some of the older subdivisions that are struggling to attract new buyers. And again, it's that using new mobility as a catalyst. Let's look a little bit about parking technology, where it's not as big of a struggle as in urban areas with high value real estate. But again, as we start to concentrate development, you'll begin to see that you've got parking spaces where you can better use the parking that you have to help reveal that to people who have an app or where there are monument signs. Again, this can help you with adaptable garages as well, because you can in real time measure how much demand there is and switch that space out to other uses over time if it's not being used. One of the big challenges right now is because many suburbs are auto-centric, you have a high demand now, but you know that it's going to taper down in the present. So we're trying to help our clients figure out how to do those adaptable garages. Some of the models look a little bit like this, where you need to have level floors in order to convert that space to office or housing over time. So what we're looking at are there ways to use modular pieces of infrastructure so that that building can adapt over time. This, like David was saying, it will in the future be opportunistic to use self-parking technology so that you can squeeze more cars in. And this research really was conducted to optimize the number of spaces in this established footprint. And as you can see, anybody who's in the middle with self-park technology, you can just basically use technology to move the cars in and out and then in and out of the garage. Of course, the big challenge is going to be phasing. So a lot of what we're going to be looking at is how do you do the striping and the technology on the floor to help that car see, so to speak, and read how to get exactly into that space. And maybe in the near term, it'll be a little bit half and half. So now let's actually drill down into what David was talking about for the changes in retail. And one of the things that we've been tracking at WGI is what is happening with e-commerce. There's been some really eye-opening studies recently about warehousing and how retail stores that are brick and mortar, like a Target or even Whole Foods, how they are shifting to a model where people still come to the store, but that you're actually fulfilling online deliveries in the same place. So maybe what you have is those deliveries going out the retail front or on the side, but then you've got stores that are chopping themselves in half, so to speak, so that there's a delivery warehouse in the back, but people are in the front. And again, they're changing that into an experiential type of experience for their shoppers. And then on the right, there's this new phenomenon called dark stores. And those look like grocery stores, but they're not for customers. They are for shoppers fulfilling orders, and they go through and fill a bag and then send it out to whoever's making that delivery. From a urbanism standpoint, you do lose some of that vibrancy that you get with the stores. Again, some of these technologies are already unfolding. So you've got lockers everywhere. Amazon bought Whole Foods basically as a real estate and logistics play. And then you've got some of the companies like FedEx beginning to experiment with both the delivery van with a driver, but with drones on top to deliver packages. And what that does is it allows the driver to actually deliver 3 packages at once. He or she will deliver 1 and then 2 more. And if you think about it from a sustainability point of view in the suburbs, that does actually more efficiently get deliveries in expansive neighborhoods in a way that may have burned up a lot more energy previously. So that's an exciting application of some of these technologies. If we go to design, we've got 2 different things here, and then I'll close up and tee up for Dan. This is from Walmart, and Walmart is actually not only in competition with Amazon, but they're in competition with themselves. So you've got their brick and mortar and their online stores competing. So they've come up with a couple of just drawings and renderings. I'm not sure they've done this one yet, where they've built a park out front towards the corridor. They've added the restaurants that David talked about and a little bandstand here. And in the foreground, you can see pickup, because what they want to do is as you come and pick up your online order, they want you to stay. And that is what we're talking about here with the convergence of these 2 trends of e-commerce and of retail. And I'm going to finish it up with, okay, what would this actually look like with the strip mall, the ubiquitous strip mall? And really what we're looking at is the old strip mall is repurposed, where you've got renovated neighborhood retail, medical centers are actually increasing, and then in the back you've got a combination retail and distribution center where maybe drones actually fly out the back there. And then in the forefront, you slowly reclaim that parking, and you can get new multifamily housing that's 5 stories tall, because we've got to think about some of the constructability here and what will pencil out. And then in the front, you can have the store pickup and event space, but also a mobility hub where a lot of these new families living there or shoppers coming there can pick up a car share or a bike share. And it's where, with these red striping here, maybe you can begin to introduce the autonomous shuttles and buses, the transit that can make its way around the site, in the corridor, and even maybe last couple of miles to the neighborhoods. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Daniel, and I appreciate your attention and look forward to the questions.
Very good. Hello, everybody. I need to go to the beginning of my presentation here. Just take a moment. Okay, so my job is really to be a technologist as opposed to an urban planner. So what I'm working with are projects, clients, to look at what the technology trends are and how that will impact the kinds of issues that we've been talking about so far in today's webinar. So here's a few things that I want to share with you that we see as trends that are influenced by the technology itself. We've got a trend away from the autonomous vehicles that we're talking about 5 years ago, that you were supposed to be able to have the car go pick up your kids at soccer practice by itself, and it was going to drop you off at your office, and then it was going to drive home by itself and park. That type of autonomy really is out, because even though it might be achievable technically, nobody can afford to pay for that. If we can get technology that'll meet 80 to 90% of the use cases out there at a reasonable cost, that's great. To double the investment required in R&D to go that last 10% probably isn't going to happen. But the good news is that highly automated vehicles are in, and these are vehicles that are building upon driver assist features that will make them more highly automated in the future. In the terms of the small electric vehicles, we're seeing both shared and privately owned small electric vehicles as a tremendous trend, and have the potential of dominating our walkable suburban spaces. The driverless shuttles to do first mile, last mile at transit stations that were discussed over the past few years, we've done quite a bit of testing with those, and we're finding that they require path management consistent with the operational design domain of those vehicles, which is an SAE standard term that defines basically what the vehicle is capable of doing and then what the limitations are, what it's not capable of doing. And we do anticipate, in spite of the new technology, the cost of transportation both within and to and from the suburb will still tend to increase. I want to look at the impacts of the HAV technology on suburban freeway commuters, because this affects land value and property use and where people live, just as some of the issues that David was talking about. And what I want to share with you today and have you think about is that in artificial intelligence and highly automated vehicles, safer is enhanced by slower. And what we mean by that is that in order for these systems to work well, vehicle traffic has to slow down to a manageable level. Now, you will achieve fewer crashes, so safety goes up. But some of the disbenefits of having slower traffic are actually to have more freeway congestion. What we're seeing, though, is that even though the more freeway congestion increases what we call range anxiety for those who own electric vehicles, air pollution, fuel consumption, that people will tolerate an increase in commute if they can be connected during that commute and if they can text, if they can use email, etc., while they're in the car by delegating that driving task. And the technology to do that is very, very close today. So the public focus we anticipate is going to shift away from, hey, fix my freeway, it's terrible, to, hey, make sure I'm connected while I'm out there. I understand it's going to be terrible and take me a long time, but I want to be connected during that time. So I want to ask everybody today to think about this scenario. So let's say I'm a real estate agent and I'm going to sell you a home in the suburbs and it's 22 miles from your downtown office. But when you buy it, you're going to have to choose your commute. So here are your choices. You have an option A and an option B. So the option A is that you can drive from the suburb to the city at 45 to 65 miles per hour free flow, and you have about a 30-minute average commute. And during that time, you are doing the driving test. So your hands are on the wheel, your eyes are on the road. Option B is to slow down to 20 to 35 miles per hour, go to a 60-minute commute, but you have a smart car. Hands are off the wheel, eyes are off the road, and you can do other things. You can text, you can do wireless, you can do email. And the analogy for this would be the way our airliners fly today, where you kind of expect the pilot to have his hands and feet on the controls during takeoff and landing, right? In this scenario on option B, you still have to get your car onto the freeway and you have to get it off the freeway. But while you're out there, even though you're going slow, you can do other things. And what does it take to provide that option B? As I said, we're getting very close on the technology side. So the driver assist features you can buy today, like lane keeping, car following, the setup of behavior rules. The example in a car I recently drove, I'd love to say the manufacturer, but I probably shouldn't promote them. But basically, their car locks onto the car in front of it, and it follows it. And the only thing you have to tell it is if that car changes lanes, do you want to also change lanes? Or if that car exits the freeway, do you want to follow it? Or do you want to lock on a new car? And after you answer those two questions, whatever that car does in front of you, if it speeds up, slows down, your car does the same thing. And what that allows you to do is to not be involved in the driving task when you have that system engaged. As that system is being marketed today, there's legislation, regulation involved with dumbing it down. So you can't use it in that mode. You have to keep your hands on the wheel. You have to be able to respond when the car queries you. So in order for that type of technology to be available, we would have to have our speed limits on these freeways lowered to meet the capable operational design domains of the vehicles. And we would have to be able to legally delegate the driving task to the vehicle rather than being responsible for ourselves while the car's on the freeway. So in order to do this, our company is involved in a lot of the testing that's going on. So we're looking at the operational design domain conformity and trying to develop graceful disengagement and resilience so that when these vehicles, when the automated driving systems disengage or encounter a problem, that we handle that exit gracefully. Some of the projects that where we're working with this are in other countries like in the Middle East, where they've decreed that by 2030, 25% of all transportation trips in Dubai will be smart and driverless, and working very intently on developing testing facilities to enable that to be tested and to happen. If you are working for a state or municipal agency that's responsible for arterials, you know, some of the ideas of 2015 where we would no longer need traffic signals or signs, probably want to put that plan on the shelf because we still need traffic signals. What you may need though is for your traffic signals to output a signal to the vehicles through a connected capability to let them know that they're about to run through a red light so that that doesn't happen, or that there's a pedestrian or cyclist in the crosswalk. There is a global increase right now in pedestrian cycle deaths. It's unfortunate and alarming. My opinion is a lot of that is due to driver distraction. However, as these better systems become available, that rate of increase we hope will diminish, or at least be counterbalanced by improvements in this technology and the ability to let the vehicle stop on its own without the driver being required to do that. We are seeing already pressure to start provide protected paths for pedestrians and scooters in suburban settings. I saw if you think of a Vespa type scooter, two-wheel electric scooter out in Shanghai, one of the Shanghai suburbs I visited had a dedicated barrier separated lane just for scooters, and regardless of what was happening on the freeway, that lane was always moving at 45, 50 miles an hour and just packed full of people on scooters. One of the misconceptions about this technology is you need a lot of it in order to reap the benefits, and what we're finding, and some of the research is showing contrary to that, that very small market penetrations of connected vehicles can produce very measurable and beneficial results. So even just a market penetration of 3% of the vehicles out on the road. And part of this, if you think about it, if you have 20 cars and one is behaving well, it influences the others. And if you make one car safe in a group of 20, then all the other cars, the safety of those cars incrementally increase as well. So even though there's not a straight line relationship there, it's what we're seeing is that some of these predictions that you have to have 60 or 70% of the vehicles equipped with this technology in order to reap the benefits, just as being counterindicated by research. Some of the things, this was a study done by Florida State University. If you think about the ability to turn the driving task over to the vehicle, one of the things that's good about those vehicles is within their stated ODD, so let's say it's beneath 35 miles per hour, that car can be very precise and very accurate. So if you wanted to provide HAV only lanes, you could make narrower, shorter widths between the cars and in the other lanes, and restripe roads, or make them variable so that you can better utilize the infrastructure that you have, move more people safely, and also allow people to choose different modes of transportation, including small electric vehicles. Being involved in the testing of these first mile, last mile shuttles, what we found, I guess it was 4 or 5 years ago, we started testing these in closed test facilities, but this rate of disengagement is the key measure. So how often does the vehicle just kind of, the software gives up and says, I can't handle whatever I'm seeing and I need to just come to a stop. And that does still happen even with the better software we have today. And so that's the technical issue that we're dealing with that needs to be overcome to increase the impact and the use of these vehicles. So I won't go through all of these, maybe just pick out a couple. Oh, the important one, fourth bullet, is that ACES vehicles cannot yet safely cross signalized intersections. That's without an attendant on board. That's an important one, because if you're going to provide first mile, last mile service to a transit station for people's homes, say within a 1 or 2 mile radius, you're still going to encounter stop signs and signals. And so far, we are not able with the technology to achieve a safety rate that's high enough to get that vehicle through signalized intersections. So that's an area that requires further R&D to really make these vehicles have the impact that they're capable of having. And right now, if you look at the financial aspects of that, the cost comparisons between what it would take to provide a driverless shuttle like this, so you save money because you don't have to provide a driver, you just have to buy the vehicle, and the vehicles are not that terribly expensive. But the cost comparative, just turning it over to ride hailing like Uber and Lyft, is still not favorable. So you're still paying more for the first mile, last mile service with these vehicles than you would pay if you were having people rely completely on ride hailing or ride sharing services. So some things still need to change for this autonomous vehicle to be effective. Where they are promised, though, in developments around the country, the rental rates are going up. People like the idea. They like the idea of being carried from a parking space to the front door of the building in a vehicle like this. So they do have value from the developer standpoint. We're going to continue to hear them being talked about in that context. Just some changes that we'll see, that are pretty well known trends. The idea that people will be able to switch from owning cars to more shared usage. Cost of transportation does go down for the individual in that case, and some of the things we covered, like less parking provisions required, and some other things, including that commute. So the commute I was talking about between the suburb and the core city. Today you've got a boundary of about 15 to 30 miles. If you were able to turn the driving task over, delegate it, then people would be willing to leave even farther, commute farther. Their commute might be an hour and a half, but it would be time that they could spend working or doing other things. One of the global trends that we're seeing is from an engineering standpoint, is people taking up space with small electric vehicles, and especially in, for example, some of the observations I made in Shanghai is that these vehicles are finding spaces between traditional cars and buses, and they're occupying that space and using it to get around in a tremendously efficient, perhaps not as safe way, but a tremendously efficient way. And we'll see if this share with you an example.
Yo, what? Bro, are you on a bird scooter on the highway? Bro, what are you doing? Bro, what are you doing? Bro, what are you doing? Oh my gosh.
Back to my presentation here. So I know that is a little bit alarming to look at, but I do have to warn you that it's coming. Those open spaces between vehicles are going to be used by people who are perhaps more concerned about convenience than safety. And what we've seen over the years in terms of driving changes in the mobility marketplace, convenience trumps safety in people's minds. So we have to be careful of what we're going to be seeing in addition to what's already out there today in the United States. These trends are definitely coming. So what do you need to establish the CAV ecosystem in a suburban area? You've got your mobility sources. We do have standards in place that allow us to communicate with roadside infrastructure, also between vehicles themselves, also essentially with the same communication standards and capabilities. A lot of people are saying, well, things will change big time when 5G comes. That's probably true, although a lot of what we'll be able to do with 5G, we can already do today with the 4G LTV standards, and then get the cloud applications going so that these vehicles are smart. They have higher degrees of intelligence than we've seen before built into the vehicles, and also can enhance what our state and local governments need to do in terms of providing the networks, transport apps, transportation management centers to help them manage traffic, but improve the operation of the vehicles themselves. And how good the vehicles become depends on artificial intelligence advances there, the deep learning capabilities that are very promising for handling, as I said, and this is just my opinion, but 80 to 90% of the use cases out there for suburban mobility can be handled by near range, near horizon technology. And that's my presentation.
Great. I think we'll just launch into questions. We've been getting some good ones. Thank you all for your presentations. I apologize in advance if we don't get a chance to answer all the questions that came in. I'm going to try to take them in order. So we have two related questions about poverty in the suburbs and the interaction of AV technology and other technologies with that. So one is just a very pragmatic one that we can take first. Are you familiar with any funding sources or resources for poorer suburbs and communities who are trying to update or repurpose their spaces? I assume for advanced transportation, among other things. The changes presented here are very exciting for wealthier places, but daunting for declining communities. So I have a partial answer to that. CNU has started to follow the opportunity zone opportunity, and I'll put a link to all the audience members to an article that Rob Studeville put together that has a link to a map of all the opportunity zones in the country, many of which are suburban. So that's one possibility, but I'll open that up to the presenters. David. Oh, you're still muted. Unmute.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you, whoever just unmuted me. First of all, it's a really important question, and thank you. And there is no good enough answer, but that said, opportunity zones clearly matter. There are obviously more of them in urban than suburban areas, but they do exist in suburbs. But I think it's important to note that when a shopping center or a mall redevelops into an urban mixed-use walkable center, whatever, the fiscal value of that generally increases. We've done a series of studies somewhere between 8 and 16 times. Now, obviously, there are more costs, but they do not nearly compare in extent to the fiscal benefits. And it's going to be very important, I think, increasingly important for suburbs to create more high-value urban centers, particularly as malls decline. Something like a couple hundred malls are scheduled to probably close this year alone, to unlock the fiscal value that's basically buried in them to begin to address the higher costs that suburbs really are facing, aggravated by the fact that most of the nonprofits that deal with poverty, whether it's health or social service or workforce readiness, et cetera, are still in cities. They haven't followed the population. They're more than half the folks living under the poverty line live in suburbs today, not cities. First time in our history. The social service network hasn't followed them out. This said, you raised a second important point in that conversation, which is this just all about wealthy suburbs. And frankly, it's a lot easier to do these things if you're an affluent suburb. There's more disposable income around. But the story goes far beyond that. I would say roughly half the suburbs in which we're creating new urban centers are not affluent suburbs. They are in a number of cases in parts of the country, I hate to pick on Ohio, but parts of Ohio where there is very little knowledge industry driven economic growth, et cetera. But where the change in demographics is so profound, there are so many more folks who are singles and couples who for other reasons would like access to urban walkable housing, that something like the Dayton Mall south of Dayton, an area that is a very, I'll call it stagnant economy, is on its way to developing a new urban walkable mixed-use core in its midst because there's so much of the demand for housing in this area, southwest of Columbus, is going to be for urban mixed-use walkable. Folks may not be all that affluent, but they can afford to launch this housing market, and there's nothing there. And this story is being told, driven by the changes in housing demographics that unlock the ability to create these higher value places basically across the country. This is the beginning of an answer.
So just the other day, an idea came up for a lower income neighborhood we're working in to have a low speed electric network. So just as we're trying to build up the idea of bike networks, maybe we can actually use some of these new lower speed electric pathways to be that system where deliveries, people on golf carts, people on bicycles, e-bikes, and then setting the stage for an autonomous shuttle pilot so that those lower income communities are pilot ready, which I think is an important thing we're going to have to do with our communities, because some of these pilots are in and of themselves economic stimulants and attractions. So I think if you can start, with that core of moving people in these low speed electric modes, we have golf carts down here, and those are becoming more and more of neighborhood electric vehicles, recognized vehicles. So it's not going to be everywhere, but again, the innovation in just vehicle making right now is really pretty impressive, and they're far less expensive than an automobile.
Great point, Lisa, that we tend to think of kind of the shiny, newest, but we actually already have vehicles that could be repurposed. And
right.
Can I add a quick postscript here? Because I think, Lisa, you really touch on something that's really essential and I overlooked, which is that costs about $11,000 a year on average to own and operate a car. Newer cars may have cost more, but older cars break down more, so the amount doesn't really change that much. It changes somewhat, but bottom line, if you live anywhere near the poverty line in this country, you have a household income under $40,000, in many cases under $30,000 a year, you're not owning and operating a lot of cars at $11,000 a year, meaning when you are forced out of a city where you have access to public transit to a suburb, you become isolated from jobs, from healthcare, from education, from each other. And anything that we can do with autonomous shuttles where we can get the cost down, or other ways that provide take advantage of micro technology to restore access by providing transit to these folks is hugely important.
I'd like
Dan,
to
you want to add something?
Yeah, just from the transportation perspective, we're seeing a shift away from the billion-dollar transportation improvement projects because that money just isn't there. But if you look at the cost of adding a lane to an urban freeway like the 405 in LA, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars for a few miles of infrastructure. And that money could be reapportioned, reappropriated to other things where you can buy a whole lot of mobility for $100 million. And when you use it to add a freeway lane or to rebuild an interchange, yeah, you might get some transportation benefit, but you're also going to just see that new space or that new capacity fill up with latent demand very, very quickly.
There's a follow-up question. It's more of a macro question and a troubling one, an important troubling one, is that, cities are becoming more desirable and people are being forced out, priced out, moving outward. Then we're doing work to retrofit suburbs, making parts or whole swaths of suburbs more desirable. Are we just moving the problem around? This person asks, where will low-income people end up living if suburbs and urban cores are become more popular, both become more popular? Will there be successful city suburban metro areas? In other words, sort of, mega places that are haves and have-nots. That's how I read the question. And where do you see that playing out across America, e.g. West Coast, East Coast, Midwest?
Well, it's already happening. If you look at where our economic growth has come from, it's something like probably 5 or 6% of U.S. cities provide more than half of U.S. growth today, for example. And those are precisely the regions that whoever asked this also very good question probably had in mind. and I'm going to make this worse before we offer a ray of hope. There is no community or suburb I know of that can afford to get off the bandwagon of trying to become more walkable, more desirable, more fun, more amenitized, because if you want tax base, you've got to attract the workforce, educated folks, and those are the environments they seek, who in turn attract jobs and investment. I don't know of a community today that feels it can afford not to do that. When it does that, whether it is a city or a suburb, this listener was so right, it gentrifies. It makes these places more desirable and more expensive. If we don't, and do quickly in our core cities and the suburbs that are beginning to emulate this urban model, find ways to tap the incredible increase in value that walkable urban places achieve to pay for an agenda of equity. And it's not just affordable housing, it's also providing job training, childcare, helping people deal with jail records, et cetera, that keep folks out of the workforce so that they can't benefit in the economic opportunity if they want to. They're stuck. Most people, frankly, today who want a job have one. The folks who don't have jobs can't have jobs because there's an obstacle, a kid at home and no one else, a single mother, that kind of thing. If we don't tap the urban wealth we're creating in cities and suburbs alike to address these issues, we are going to push folks out. And it's not that we are certainly have less and have more regions, but what's really happening is that poverty is moving further and further and further from the core, where it's harder and harder and harder to address and help. And the answer is the value we're creating and tapping it.
I hate to put a lot of pressure on Dan, but I think the work that he's doing is part of the answer and solution to what we're talking about. For suburbs, I think I look back at what Arlington, Virginia did, not the wealthy Amazon-driven Arlington, but the Arlington 20, 25 years ago that was kind of climbing out of recessions, where the whole community decided it was going to concentrate its density along the subway lines and then leave the expanses of its suburban-like setting the same, so that you could have the best of both worlds. I think that story is actually one that could play out in the suburbs, where you densify and amenify the corridors first, and then you've got all that interstitial area where last couple of miles to feed people to those new transit corridors that are served by autonomous BRT and shuttles that we can build far cheaper than we can do today, because they're rubber tire on the same rights of way that we already have. So I think if we can make equity the goal, then what we can start to do is target the land use and transportation to meet that, and maybe do both. There's a lot of room in some of these suburban areas that we just don't have in our cities. So again, will it pencil out? That's the big question.
Sadly, I love your thoughts, Lisa. The only way to pencil out equity is you've got to have public dollars invested. Right. Arlington is a great example of leaving neighborhoods as unaffected as possible. They've still gone up considerably in value.
Right.
One of the other lessons Arlington offers is that when you create these new urban places in suburbs, redevelop them all, you don't touch a blade of grass on anybody's front lawn, which is something Arlington accomplished. Mm-hmm. You do still have the social impacts to deal with.
Oh, sure.
One ray of hope here is that the technology that you need to use to share mobility is pretty inexpensive compared to other things that can help you. So I'm not saying that everyone can afford the newest or greatest iPhone, but you can get ready access to shared mobility in ways that are less expensive, and the percentage of penetration of these devices into our socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods is very, very high. Mm-hmm. And so there is a way for folks to access those services well, if those services can be made available.
Right.
And finally, I'm sort of going to round this out with a sort of a trio of questions about equity and availability and thoughtful planning. These are actually two very different and very deep questions, but I'm going to try to put them together. they have to do with the history of the suburbs and racial attitudes separate from attitudes about poverty, and sort of NIMBYism. So the first one, a participant asked, how can AV, I'm going to paraphrase this a little, how can AVs work with this intense implementation when they, I assume designers and planners, have such a hard time seeing darker skinned individuals? And I note, of course, that this panel is a white panel, I'm white. And so perhaps part of this question is, who's at the table doing the designing? How can we make sure that designers and planners are representative of the people they're working with, and that they do see people of all backgrounds? So that's the first question. The second one is a little bit about attitude shifts, and so I'll hold that one back for a minute. So how do we make sure that this planning process really sees and serves all people?
I can take a stab, but if one of you would like to, the AV was the focus here. I will note it could be AV, it could be planning the new downtown for Sandy Springs, Georgia, and its cultural center. It could be anything. It's a profoundly good question. I'm sure you've all heard the statement, if it doesn't include us, it's not about us, and that's really true. And one of the tasks that we all have is to make sure, and you know, we need all the reminders we can get, as from our good listener here, to reach out and find ways to include the voices that aren't at the table, and we may forget should be at the table and need to be at the table, because each one sees life differently and in ways that collectively are all relevant to the solution. And one thing I love listening to Dan focus on are all the sort of low cost, quickly to market, more available mobility solutions when many of us can be distracted by the shiny billion-dollar object. And I know, Dan, if you want to comment, but I think that's part of the story, is hearing those people so we can start meeting their needs with the kinds of things, Dan, you're talking about.
Sure, you know, I'll say right now, I'm not qualified to answer the question because I'm a technologist. Fortunately, the technology itself is blind, but I would say that the willingness for people to participate is very important. A lot of the testing that we've done on the automated connected electric vehicles has focused on people's reaction. What does it feel like to step on that vehicle and to be there when you're moving, but you don't see a steering wheel or you don't see anyone controlling that vehicle? What are people's reactions to it? What are their concerns about security, safety, equity, fairness, and how these are set up and how they work? And the only limits I see on that are really just the willingness of people to participate in these tests, and then creating open forums where people will have access to participate. And that's probably where I think we could do a much better job, is creating forums where a very large cross-section of people can experience this technology and give some feedback on how do they feel about it, how do they react to it. Because the beautiful thing here is that it is still under development. There still are opportunities to change it, to improve it, to modify it, to allow people to feel good about the opportunities for mobility that are being provided. It's not a done deal yet by any stretch. So I know if anybody wants to contact me to get involved in any of the pilots that we're doing, things like that, I'm happy to make sure that those doors are open.
I'll just add quickly to Dan's comment, it's do all those things and also tell us what they need from it. It's somebody who has access to a car might need one thing. Somebody who is isolated might need something else and a lot sooner. I'll also remind us all that suburbs will probably be majority of color before the whole country is, and the whole country is going to be majority of color sometime in the 2040s. So suburbs will get there first.
Well, and the tag team on that, it's just important as planners to constantly go out in the neighborhoods, especially when there's not a project, which is, you know, how we tend to do it, where it's like, oh, we have to do community engagement around this plan or around this project. And, you know, sometimes it's good just to go listen. And one of the things recently in a conversation I learned about was the #1 mobility request was not mobility, it was we don't have enough laundromats. So immediately I got online and it's like, do they have mobile laundromats? And I think it's really important to point out that just as we have different types of vehicles, we've also got a lot of businesses now on wheels that we didn't have 10 years ago. And so our ability to react and to patch in things to neighborhoods in need, they're out there. But you have to go out and listen, and it's like, what do you need? And you can't go with the preconception that, oh, it must be an electric bike share or the golf carts or an AV. Sometimes it's just those trips that people make every day that aren't anywhere around. And that, I think, is the essence of great planning and innovation and building community.
Or the trips they can't make. Sorry.
Right. Yeah.
That's a great point about listening kind of all the time.
Right.
As you all were talking, I was thinking of a couple of things that would help with this question, going back to, I think, just changing the profession, which is going to take time, and people are working to make sure there are more planners and designers of color, because that's one of the first important things. But the other is that, any place where we're doing work has a whole history, a location where you're doing sort of an agnostic test of technology. Things have happened there over the years, and the people who live there know what's happened. And I've been struck time and again, when you go into a community, how much of the first many sometimes community meetings are spent listening to people tell you what has happened in that community. It's not a waste of time. You're ignorant going in, and you have to know what that community has gone through before you start doing, something new. So I don't know if that answers the participant's question, but I hope so, at least a start. Another question related to this is, how do you shift attitudes toward technology in suburbs that may be affluent? And actually, I'm messing this up. How do you shift attitudes in affluent suburbs to address the need for equity in the community and region, especially aging communities that are attracting California retirees? I'm going to reshape that just a touch, because as someone politely mentioned, we're getting away from technology here, and that's what we're supposed to be talking about. So let me reframe this as, when you're working on new technologies in communities, especially affluent ones, do you encounter NIMBYs who say, we don't want your fancy vehicles here, go somewhere else? And how do you work with that? And they bring up aging communities. I think they mean the communities themselves are aging, not that they have aging people in them. But let's assume for a minute that you have a lot of aging people in a community who are protesting. Is there something you would say about bringing in new technologies to, let's say, people who are kind of set in their ways and don't want to see those new things happening?
I have a thought I could share on that one. Just starting out, one of the ways to influence people's behavior or their openness to changes is financial. And one of the great motivators for all of us is decreased cost of services, transportation, et cetera. But what I'd like to my philosophy on this, and what I'd like to share, is that our tradition in the United States of providing transportation, there's this built-in theory that everybody has to pay the same. So, it goes back to the tollways of the 1950s, where you pull up and you drop a quarter in the basket, and so everybody has to pay 25 cents to drive down the road. We no longer need that paradigm. We've got people can have apps on their phones. I would love to see cities, and I haven't seen one yet, but I'd love to see a city with these express lanes to grandfather people in and allow the people to use the express lanes for free that are in the disadvantaged neighborhoods that are between the suburbs and the city, and just do it with an account. If they have an account where some people pay $15 for that ride and some people don't pay anything for that ride. I think that's fair. I fly quite a bit, so what are the chances that the person sitting next to me on the airplane paid the exact same amount for their seat that I did? The probability is actually pretty low. So I'd love to see our transportation agencies, our governments, our municipalities get out of this mindset that everybody's got to pay the same amount for transportation services and start to build some equity into that so that people can pay for what they use, limit their payment to what they use, and also pay a rate that makes sense for their economic situation.
Lisa, go ahead if you want to.
I haven't really heard, the more of what I hear are things like transportation improvements, and I've done a lot of work on bike share, that bringing a bike lane in will actually accelerate gentrification that lower income communities fear, that any of these enhancements will begin to happen. Sometimes you do hear some NIMBY reaction, and at bottom it's like, we'll get people who aren't like me coming in or through my neighborhood. I think those arguments get raised all the time, and really what you need to do is make the case, show examples of where the bike lane worked out, and then go from there with other types of improvements. So over time, we're going to have people looking at the autonomous transit ways and where they worked and how did they operate and what happened. But again, I think it's those stories that resonate with people, the pilots, what happened there, that are going to be the next steps of, well, what were the lessons learned? How did you tighten it up? How did you get what you wanted? How's it performing today? The same kind of questions we should be asking really about any of our infrastructure.
I think that's been capably answered, and I don't know what time we have left, but Lisa, Schamess, do we have time for one more, or do you need to?
We don't really have time for one more comment, but I have like a mind-blowing thing that I'd like 2 minutes for after you talk, David. It was a correction of an earlier question, and it just blew my mind. So you go ahead, David.
Well, actually, I think in the spirit of time, I'd like to turn it back to you, because I think we had some good answers.
So the person who asked about not seeing darker skinned people earlier meant it literally. Apparently, some AVs have trouble spotting people with darker skin at night. And I sat there with that question and said, like, I have to bring that up. That's
so funny, because that's how I interpreted the question, but I thought I must be wrong.
That's how she meant it. So I thought I'd bring it up again.
Okay, so
that's terrible. What are we doing about that?
Yeah, so what we're doing about that is working with creating denser data clouds, denser fields around these vehicles. There is a problem, definitely. This is a very smart question. There definitely is a problem with object recognition if you're using machine vision. And we have the same problem, believe it or not, with traffic lights. So if the vehicle's trying to see if a light is green, yellow, or red, depending on the different shades of that, there can be problems. So what a lot of us on the technical side are doing is relying upon connectivity of that vehicle so it can pick up the fact that that person has a phone in their pocket that has Bluetooth running or some way to identify it, and immediately know that that's a person or a potential person because there is a phone there. So as an engineer and as a technologist, what we're trying to do is create multiple ways for that vehicle to be smart, because you're right, you cannot rely on machine vision all the time when it comes to transportation safety. There has to be other ways that you are informing that AI system on that car. So it's a brilliant question. I'm glad, Lisa, that you went back to correct it, because it's funny, when I heard the question, I thought,
yeah,
that's what I thought it was, but then I thought, well, no, it must be something different. But thank you for the question.
This was a unique and important way to merge equity and technology.
Right. So it's an important cautionary note for all of us. I'm gonna, I guess, hand this back to Jen to say goodbye. But I really appreciate everyone's time today and wisdom on the question of where next for the suburbs.
Thank you, and I want to thank everybody for their focus on equity in this, because it's probably the issue that will most influence whether we get this right or not, our ability to build equity into it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists for your wonderful presentations and the great conversation we just had with the Q&A. We will be sending a recording around. We again encourage you to share that recording out with anyone who finds it useful. And we've got the handouts for the slides in the handout section. So thank you all again. Thanks, Lisa, for moderating, and our panelists. And we'll wrap it up here. Have a great day.
And I'm going to buy my book now with the code word webinar, right?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Buy that book. We'll send that out in email too.
Thank you. Here's your $5. Okay, thanks. Okay.
Thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.